Walk with me through the streets of central London and you'll see monuments everywhere. Statues of Winston Churchill standing tall, memorials to brave RAF pilots gleaming in the afternoon light. The story we've been told about the Second World War is beautifully simple and deeply heroic. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The British people sacrificed everything, spent every last penny to defeat fascism.
By 1945, we're taught Britain was bankrupt, a noble ruin that had given its wealth to save the world. But what if I told you there's another version of this story? A version you won't find in elite school textbooks. A version remembered with bitterness in Bengali villages and Egyptian cities. In this other telling, Britain didn't go broke fighting the war at all. Instead, they found someone else to pay for it. They ran up a massive tab on a credit card that belonged to their poorest subjects, financed the war by extracting a forced loan from their colonies, and when the war ended, they simply refused to pay it back.
This is the story of the sterling balances, the greatest financial heist in history. It's about how the British Empire extracted what amounts to trillions of dollars from India and Egypt to subsidize the British economy. It challenges everything we think we know about the good war and reveals the cold financial calculation that allowed Britain to rebuild its welfare state on the backs of starving peasants. To understand this theft, we need to look past the battlefield and into the bank vault. In 1939, the British Empire was the largest trading bloc on Earth, tied together not just by the Royal Navy, but by a currency system called the sterling area. The rules were simple but absolute. Every colony from India to Malaya to Nigeria had to hold their national reserves in British pounds. They couldn't hold gold or US dollars. They had to bank in London.
The financial heart of the empire beat inside the Bank of England. When war broke out, Britain faced an immediate crisis. Modern warfare is staggeringly expensive. You need steel, oil, rubber, and millions of tons of food for your armies. Britain, being a small island, didn't have these resources. They had to buy them. In those early days, Britain used gold reserves to purchase weapons from the United States, but the gold disappeared frighteningly fast. By 1941, Britain was technically insolvent, unable to pay cash for the tools of war. This is where the looting began. The British government realized something crucial. While they couldn't force America to give them free supplies, they absolutely could force their colonies to do so. The crown jewel was India, not just a source of soldiers, but a massive producer of textiles, steel, food, and raw materials. The British government needed these Indian goods to fight in North Africa and the Middle East, but they didn't have money to pay the Indian producers. So they invented a financial mechanism that was both ingenious and utterly ruthless. Here's how it worked. When the British Army needed uniforms or rice or steel from India, they'd place an order with the Indian government. The Indian government would pay local producers in rupees. But Britain didn't pay the Indian government back in rupees or gold. Instead, they simply made a bookkeeping entry at the Bank of England in London, crediting India's account with pounds sterling. On paper, this looked fair. India was selling goods, Britain was paying for them. The Indian government was accumulating a massive savings account in London. These were the famous sterling balances. By war's end, India held 1.3 billion pounds in these accounts. In today's money, that's hundreds of billions of dollars, a fortune. It technically made India a creditor nation and Britain a debtor. But there was a catch that transformed this transaction from trade into theft.
The British government declared these sterling balances blocked. India couldn't withdraw the money. They couldn't exchange pounds for dollars to buy machinery from America. They couldn't buy gold.
The money was trapped in London, a frozen asset. Britain was taking real goods, real food, real labor from India and paying with an IOU that could never be cashed.
The consequences on the ground in India were catastrophic. Because the Indian government had to print millions of extra rupees to pay local producers for the war effort, the money supply exploded. But all the goods, the cloth, the rice, the steel, were being shipped out to feed British armies. There was nothing left for Indian people to buy with all that new money. Too much money chasing too few goods leads to one inevitable outcome: hyperinflation. Rice and wheat prices in India skyrocketed. The poor living hand-to-mouth found their daily wages couldn't buy a single meal. This wasn't an accident, it was calculated policy. The famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, usually remembered as a hero of liberal economics, was a key architect of this system. As an advisor to the British Treasury during the war, Keynes understood exactly what was happening. He knew that printing money in India to pay for the war caused inflation. He privately described it as a forced transfer of value. He knew they were reducing consumption among the Indian poor to fund consumption by British soldiers. The most horrifying result of this financial engineering was the Bengal Famine of 1943. We're often told it was caused by a cyclone or Japanese capture of Burma. Those were factors, but the primary driver was inflation caused by the sterling system. The British government was printing money to buy up all the rice in Bengal to feed the army and export to the Middle East. Rice prices rose so high that Bengali peasants couldn't afford to eat. 3 million people died of starvation.
They didn't die because there was no food. They died because the financial system had priced them out of existence. While people died in Kolkata's streets, the sterling balances in London kept growing. Every sack of rice taken from a starving village added more digits to India's bank account in England. It's a grotesque image, a mountain of wealth accumulating in the Bank of England, literally built on the starvation of empire subjects. British officials in Delhi and London were aware of the suffering. The Viceroy of India wrote secret letters to London warning that the financial burden on India was becoming unbearable, that they were breaking the back of the Indian economy. But Winston Churchill and his cabinet ignored these warnings. Their priority was defeating Hitler. If India had to be squeezed dry to pay for victory, so be it. Churchill famously dismissed the famine, saying Indians bred like rabbits.
By 1945, the war was over. Britain had won, but financial reckoning had arrived. The United Kingdom owed its colonies a staggering amount. Total sterling balances owed to India, Egypt, Ireland, and others amounted to over £3 billion, larger than Britain's entire gross domestic product. Leaders of newly independent nations expected payment. India was on the verge of independence. Indian leaders like Nehru and Gandhi looked at those balances as seed capital for their new nation. They planned to use that money to build factories, dams, and schools. They believed Britain would honor its debt. They were wrong.
The betrayal began almost immediately. In post-war negotiations, the British government made clear they had no intention of paying the full value. They began a campaign to discredit the debt itself. Leading British figures argued the debt was unfair to Britain. Because Britain had fought to defend the empire, including India, the colonies should have contributed freely. They called the debt monstrous and unjust. Imagine the audacity. After forcing India to provide goods, causing famine and inflating their currency, the British now argued India should cancel the debt as a thank you for being protected. Churchill wanted to simply default, to tell India the debt was wiped clean. But the new Labour government under Clement Attlee realised total default was impossible. It would destroy confidence in the British pound forever. They needed a more subtle way to steal the money. The British Treasury devised a compromise that was essentially slow-motion default. They told India the money would remain blocked. India couldn't withdraw the principal. Britain would release a tiny trickle each year, just enough for essential imports, but not enough for development. This was the state of play as empire dissolved. Money that could have transformed India was held hostage in London.
The British government used that capital to prop up their currency, to maintain the pound's value so British consumers could buy cheap imports.
But the British had an even darker plan. In 1949, they devalued the pound against the dollar by 30%. Overnight, India effectively lost 30% of its national savings. The machinery they wanted to buy from America suddenly became 30% more expensive. By devaluing currency, Britain wiped out a huge chunk of what they owed without paying a penny. Throughout the post-war period, inflation continued eating away at the real value of these balances.
While India struggled to feed its population in the 50s, Britain enjoyed a post-war boom. The blocked sterling balances played a crucial role in this recovery. The National Health Service, rightly Britain's pride, was built on financial stability, partly subsidized by forced empire loans. The average British family enjoyed living standards artificially supported by invisible wealth transfer from the East.
Economist Utsa Patnaik estimates Britain extracted $45 trillion from India over the colonial period. That's 17 times the current UK GDP. It explains why a country that was among the world's richest in the 18th century became one of the poorest in the 20th, while a small island became a global superpower.
It took decades for the issue to be resolved. Balances were released so slowly, their value eroded so significantly that by the time India received final payments, the money was a shadow of its former self. The British government never apologized. They never acknowledged defaulting on their obligations. The narrative in Britain remained that they'd graciously granted independence to India. The financial reality that they'd looted the country was buried in technical documents.
The sterling trap was one of history's most successful financial operations. It saved the British economy from collapse and allowed Britain to retreat from empire without bankruptcy. But it was victory bought with fraud. It serves as a dark lesson in currency power. If you control the banking system, you can steal more wealth with a fountain pen than an army can with guns. The British Empire proved the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a friend who holds your wallet.